Crazy Eddie's greatest TV and video sale ever. Get anything and everything in TV and video. Crazy Eddie's greatest TV and video sale ever. It's going to be insane.
Meet Eddie Antar, founder of the Crazy Eddie electronics chain and father of what's considered to be the biggest retail fraud in history. To anyone living in New York City in the 1980s, Crazy Eddie was inescapable. With stores spanning all 5 boroughs and raucous commercials airing around the clock, everyone in the city knew where to get rock-bottom prices on the hottest electronics. But behind the scenes was an utter parody of the American dream, one that led to Eddie becoming an international fugitive after his multi-million-dollar deception was uncovered. As it turns out, the legend of Crazy Eddie extends far beyond what headlines of the day suggest. This was, in fact, an intricate tale of family drama, creative scheming, and playing the system from the inside. So where does this all begin, and what caused the downfall of Crazy Eddie? Eddie Antar was born in New York City on December 18, 1947. His grandparents had come over from Aleppo decades prior, and Eddie's father Sam was already a budding businessman who opened his first store at the age of 19. The Alpine culture was known for forging the hardest working merchants in the world, a trade ingrained in the Antar children from day one. Eddie himself seemed like a natural fit for this world, having gotten an early start in sales by peddling cheap merchandise around the Manhattan Port Authority terminal at the age of 13, in lieu of being in school. In his book Retail Gangster, Gary Weiss recounts that Eddie's father Sam probably got him in at a handful of seedy kiosks in the area owned by friends and family. Practicing his schmoozing on most anyone he'd meet, Eddie wasn't above browbeating potential customers even as a teenager. It's said Eddie had a knack for duping tourists into paying up to 10 times the market rate for electronics, while convincing them they had in fact gotten a bargain. This hard-hustling nature led family friends to dub him Kelso, taking after the champion racehorse. By 1963, Eddie was done with school, feeling he was better off honing his trade than wasting time learning theory in a classroom. He was adamant that his drive and charm would be enough to make it on his own, something he proved correct when he'd pocket up to $1,000 a week working at an uncle's shop. Soon, Eddie found himself working at an appliance store owned by his father and another relative, where he'd find even greater success. It's uncertain where he first got the nickname Crazy Eddie, but one story goes that some former classmates bestowed it upon him after seeing Eddie pressure a housewife into buying a deep fryer. Eddie apparently blocked the exit with a shelf after she remained undecided, telling her to either buy the fryer or make herself comfortable housekeeping. Times were good for Eddie, but his vaulting ambition made him hungry for bigger opportunities. A 20-year-old Eddie convinced his father to go in on a small electronics business with him and his cousin Ronnie. It would be called Sights and Sounds ERS, named after the three of them. Unfortunately, this shop didn't live up to expectations. Selling consumer electronics was a tough gig for the little guy in the late 1960s. Fair trade laws meant that the manufacturers could fix the price of their products across the board, leaving no wiggle room for discounts. This, of course, stifled competition and gave the major department stores an advantage. And so, little over a year after opening, Sights and Sounds was on the verge of bankruptcy. Eddie remained unfazed despite the mounting debt. Persuading his father to buy his cousin out, he immediately went to work finding creative ways to turn things around. For starters, Eddie refused to be bossed around by the manufacturers. No, he would decide what the product cost. Though popular with customers, this caused the outraged manufacturers to refuse Eddie any more business. To get around this, Eddie began purchasing from dubious third parties like corner distributors, which turned out to be a front for underground gambling. With their assistance, Eddie had his hands on top-notch product for far less than the manufacturers demanded. Now he could go about forging his empire. Eddie knew he needed a distinct persona to create a presence as a businessman so as to stand out. His slicked back hair and leather jackets made comparisons to the Fonz unavoidable, and his tendency to wear sweaters to the point of being in tatters gave off an air of eccentricity. Around this point, Eddie took up a strict bodybuilding routine, a habit he kept up his whole life long. Yet it wasn't enough to simply cultivate this imposing image. He'd also need a catchy name. And what better name for his larger-than-life personality than Crazy Eddie? As he wheeled and dealed, Eddie made every effort to live up to his new moniker. According to the book Frankensteins of Fraud, Eddie once convinced a customer to take off his shoes before snatching them and keeping them behind the counter until they brokered a sale. Eddie ran a tight ship, training his staff to talk customers into deals on expensive goods through compliments and redirection. This pushy approach to sales was only part of what made him so successful, however. Soon, Eddie began concocting unethical and sometimes illegal means of securing every last dollar for his growing business. Eddie commanded a strong devotion from his employees by treating them different than his competitors. Since everyone was a relative or close family friend, Eddie did away with the punch clock system and gave his staff more leeway than other corporate suits would. Even with his customers trusting him to get them the best deals, Eddie developed a system he taught to his employees for how to squeeze every last penny out of them. They were shown how to upsell customers on fancier products and talk them into extended warranties that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Floor models, ordinarily offered at discount pricing, were repackaged and sold as though they were factory sealed. Such techniques, paired with the aggressive bombardment from sales floor staff, meant that few walked out of Sights and Sounds empty-handed. With that, Eddie Antar was quickly becoming the talk of the town. Word of mouth certainly laid the foundation for the early success of Sights and Sounds, but it was his legendary advertising campaign that knocked it into the stratosphere. Eddie made his first ventures in radio and television promotion through WCBS-FM, who sold him on a 2-for-1 ad block for a paltry $5. To seal the deal, Eddie allegedly told the account executive to show his resolve by peeing on a bus, to which he was said to have complied. The myth goes that even with such a bargain, Eddie managed to stiff the radio station, who for some reason continued running the spots. The earliest of these radio ads aired throughout 1972.
Well, summertime is here, right? And you're probably spending a lot of time around the old pad, or maybe even in your apartment. Well, if you need some good stereo gear to put that time all together, Sights and Sounds on Kings Highway in Brooklyn can supply it, and for the least spread possible. They've got all the best equipment, brands like Sony, Marantz, JBL, Infinity, Citation, or any name brand at prices that can't be beat. They've also got the largest sound room around, so you know what you're buying before you buy it, and you know you really like it first. Come on down and speak to Crazy Eddie.
These early radio ads would pale in comparison with what was to come, but it was still a few years before the now iconic television spots hit the airwaves. By 1973, Eddie had decided to ditch the name Sights and Sounds for the more eye-catching Crazy Eddie's ultra-linear sound experience, or more simply, Crazy Eddie. The shopping experience was like no other. Eddie himself promised to beat the price of any competitor, if even by a nominal amount. Sales floor staff would befriend and joke around with guests, exactly as their boss directed them. But the man who'd become the most important employee aside from Eddie himself was still working as a lowly peon in the back rooms, Eddie's teenage cousin Sammy. It took the boss a while before he saw Sammy's potential, as at first the lad was but an errand boy for the guys in charge. Sammy nevertheless saw his cousin as a charismatic figure given his business acumen and way of making people feel important. Sammy went above and beyond to curry Eddie's favor, using his position as editor of the school newspaper to fill the pages with profitable ads for the family business. Despite Eddie's seeming indifference towards Sammy at the time, he did fix him up with a $1,500 bonus during his first holiday season back in '71. Eddie always took care of his employees, not just out of benevolence, but also to ensure their loyalty for the schemes he was cooking up. Advertising guru Larry Weiss first met Eddie in 1974 through a friend who happened to be Crazy Eddie's contact at WPIX-FM. The pair hit it off, and before long, Larry became the dedicated advertising director for Crazy Eddie. Larry knew that such a unique business needed equally unique commercials, and so he went to work writing outrageous copy that the radio stations could then produce. Larry recounted that the store's tagline was originally, quote, "Crazy Eddie, the man is insane," but this was changed after Eddie got upset at such accusations. The more recognizable slogan, "His prices are insane," immediately caught on with the public, with voiceover work done by a handful of in-house talent at WPIX-FM, including one DJ Jerry Carroll. Back in those days, electronics outlets had yet to tap into the virgin territory of television advertising, so filling this niche helped turn Crazy Eddie into a household name. Before long, Eddie Antar was readying himself to open a second store in 1974. Eddie's constant critique of fair trade laws helped pave the way for their abolition in New York State by 1975. The move generated considerable loyalty from his customers, and of course, the better pricing drove sales way up. Everything was coming along smoothly. Pleased with the results of the radio ads, Eddie and Larry headhunted Jerry Carroll as the permanent spokesman for all radio ads going forward. His excitable voice rattling off Crazy Eddie's many bargains beamed over the airwaves throughout 1976, positioning the company perfectly for opening a third store. Then came the first television commercials like the beloved bathroom doo-wop.
Oh, when you think you're ready, go down to Crazy Eddie, the man who's got most everything in stereo sound. His audio selection will lead with your perfection. He's the man with all the lowest prices around. So come on down and put him to the test. See whose prices really are the best. Who fix you up with the sound that fits your place and guarantee a smile upon your face. Oh, when you think you're ready, go down to Crazy Eddie, the man who's got most everything in stereo sound. And so the story's told across the whole wide world. Crazy Eddie will not ever be undersold.
Jerry Carroll was tasked with bringing the next batch of ads to life on television, usually by yelling into the camera or doing some kind of spoof.
It's Crazy Eddie's Christmas sale with the craziest prices ever on everything in home entertainment. Audio equipment, color TVs, car stereo, CBs, Sony, Betamax, electronic TV games, even calculators and digital watches. Remember, shop around, get your best prices, but don't buy anything because Crazy Eddie will do better. And that's the Crazy Eddie guarantee. See Crazy Eddie at any one of his great locations or call Crazy Eddie at 645-1196. For the craziest prices ever, it's Crazy Eddie's Christmas sale. Crazy Eddie won't be beat. Crazy Eddie's prices are insane.
Cheap television spots led to Crazy Eddie sponsoring movies on the networks, stuffing the commercial breaks with their own ads. Most of the time, the commercials were tailor-made spoofs of whatever was playing. Often, these were shot wherever was available. For instance, the Casablanca parody was filmed on the set of a porno movie. The commercials did their work well. Crazy Eddie was now primed for the aggressive expansion it deserved. Behind the scenes, though, trouble was brewing. Most people came to associate Crazy Eddie with Jerry Carroll, whereas the real Eddie Antar had spiraled into alcoholism. He partied the nights away, fueled by a diet of vodka and junk food to the detriment of his family life. But Eddie didn't let this get in the way of becoming New York's king of electronics. Indeed, he'd show up to meetings hungover but ready to negotiate. Part of his leverage came in the form of his German shepherd named Sugar, who he had raised to be especially vicious to outsiders. The snarling beastie would accompany him to business meetings as a form of intimidation to help get Eddie what he wanted, a surprisingly effective tactic to the uninitiated. His hard partying lifestyle did of course clash with his home life. His wife Debbie saw her husband less the more stores he opened, his continuing success only pushing him further from her and the children. Making matters worse, Eddie was considered a nasty drunk who berated his wife the few times she did see him. Debbie suspected Eddie fooled around on her, promising to murder him if she found out. But it wasn't just his spouse who was tired of his antics. Eddie's own father Sam would chastise him for the comedy he played with these young floozies, and he was particularly furious that his son drank the night away on the Sabbath. On the eve of having it made as a retail god, however, something happened to Eddie that forever changed his approach to life. Eddie's shenanigans caught up with him in 1977. While leaving the club one night, he was stabbed in the stomach multiple times. Though not expected to live, he pulled through after half a dozen surgeries. Eddie's physician credited his intense exercise regimen with saving his life. But although one might have expected Eddie to turn over a new leaf, he instead doubled down. He converted his office into a de facto bar and gym, working out and pounding back drinks in between meetings, and often during them. One former employee noted that in the wake of his brush with death, Eddie went from, quote, euphoria to paranoia. As the Crazy Eddie conglomerate expanded, outsiders saw Eddie Antar as some kind of messianic figure for his faith in the electronics market. And for good reason. Up until then, there had never been a successful department store dedicated solely to these types of products. And though time would eventually prove Eddie correct, his success was built from the very beginning on deceit. Some of his techniques were not uncommon, like paying employees under the table to skirt taxation, but Eddie was bolder than that. He frequently cheated insurance companies through bogus claims. If a store flooded, for instance, Eddie brought over poor-selling products and refunded goods and strategically placed them so they too could be water damaged, boosting his payouts. During a blackout, he even put in an insurance claim for thefts that never happened. More and more Crazy Eddies opened through the back end of the 1970s, each one faded with the distributions of branded trinkets and surprise appearances by Jerry and Eddie. With Sammy Antar's father taking care of the money, the whole family was getting a piece of the action. Eddie had looped his brothers Alan and Mitchell into the business and brought on his older cousin Solomon to handle legal work. The Antar clan had by then concocted a scheme to cheat the IRS out of a significant chunk of earnings. The managers kept the receipts for cash sales apart from the rest, then sent them to Eddie's uncle's house. These receipts were then divided into 3 categories: taxable profit, the secret payroll, and skimmable money. The cash that was skimmed was then hidden in whatever nook or cranny possible. Boxes of skimmed cash could hold hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eventually, the family was skimming $1 for every 5 that the government knew about, and this was becoming a practical issue. Eddie's solution was to take a family trip to Israel. He sent his mother, father, aunt, and uncle over with thousands of dollars on them that they would use to open secret bank accounts that they could keep the money in. Whenever Eddie visited, he'd strap the cash to his body like something out of a movie. As growth accelerated, Eddie knew he needed a trusted right-hand man groomed to do exactly what needed to be done to ensure success, legal or otherwise. He'd find this in none other than his meek cousin Sammy, whom he'd put through school if he agreed to take accounting. Sammy, of course, jumped at this generous opportunity, working hard to ensure Eddie's faith wasn't misplaced. By the early 80s, there were millions of dollars being smuggled by family members and trusted friends to the Israeli banks. The best part was that while this money sat dormant, it accrued splendid amounts of interest. Of course, getting rich off money that couldn't really be spent obviously had its drawbacks. And the reported sales revenue didn't paint the most confident picture of Crazy Eddie's corporate health. Eager to take the company public, Eddie knew he'd have to settle down the grift. He resolved to skim less cash over a period of several years to not only clean up the books, but to make Crazy Eddie's yearly growth appear all that much stronger. What followed seemed nothing short of miraculous in the eyes of speculators. Eddie made bombastic promises about the future of the company that tickled their imagination, and soon Crazy Eddie was all the rage on Wall Street. The pumped-up earnings had an exponential effect on the potential value of Crazy Eddie's stock, sending it skyrocketing. Of course, Eddie had no qualms about dumping his stock on fools that thought they were buying into something burning hot. It was all part of the plan. In 1981, Sammy scored an apprenticeship at the very firm which audited Crazy Eddie, giving him an ear to the ground on Eddie's behalf. Though this was obviously a conflict of interest, the Antar family got around this by keeping Sammy off the books, at least until he had his full CPA certification. As the skimming slowed down, though, other employees would have to have their income reported to the IRS. To ensure loyalty and to make up for taxable income, on paper, these employees received handsome pay raises. When questioned by their auditors, Eddie lied, saying he wanted to reward these employees for believing in him all those years that he paid them below market wages. They bought that story hook, line, and sinker. While Eddie might have been able to pull the wool over the auditor's eyes, he found himself in hot water back home. By now, the debauchery that characterized Eddie's personal life was becoming too much for his wife and father to bear, with Sam urging Debbie to proceed with a divorce. These family squabbles were understandably a threat to an enterprise built on fraud. Debbie Antar remained hopeful for a reconciliation despite the constant betrayals by her husband. Eddie tried placating her by affirming his love early on December 31st, 1983, but to call this insincere was an understatement. Later that evening, he absconded with his mistress, who was also named Debbie, while lying that he had a crucial last-minute business meeting. Debbie 1 tracked Eddie to a secret love nest where he and Debbie 2 had stowed away in a limo too. With Debbie 1's sisters-in-law in tow, a public blowout ensued that ended in Eddie slapping his sister across the face. Eddie fled in the limo, stewing about the family drama that was about to ruin everything. The couple's marriage didn't last long after that. Eddie's father suffered a massive heart attack after hearing what happened. Amazingly, the two mended their relationship in the following weeks of the elder's recovery. Part of this was in the interest of keeping everyone's hands clean as the initial public offering loomed. The IPO went through on September 13, 1984, with shares selling for just $8 apiece, though this number would climb steadily thanks to a bit of underhanded help by the main players. Eddie himself stood to make several million from selling a good portion of his shares. Thanks to cutting back on the skimming, the company saw an unprecedented growth of 55% in the year after going public. Unsurprisingly, Eddie continued to be all the rage amongst investors and would-be shareholders. The stores themselves played into the wild mania championed by the man in his commercials, making shopping there an experience unlike any other. For instance, back in '82, Eddie managed to have the band Queen show up to promote their latest album. If such marketing stunts got people in the door, Eddie's insane prices certainly helped keep them there.
February, when we honor 3 great American leaders. Lincoln, Washington, and Crazy Eddie. Yes, Crazy Eddie has always been an American leader with the guaranteed lowest prices on anything and everything in home entertainment. Get it all now during Crazy Eddie's double-barrel Lincoln and Washington's birthday sale.
But even with a growing domain of electronic superstores, Eddie's hunger wasn't satiated. He had grander plans for his own Crazy Eddie shopping channel to air around the clock, peddling bargain-priced goods to consumers from the comfort of their own living rooms. Crazy Eddie utterly dominated the consumer electronics market throughout the mid-1980s, no doubt helped by carefully cooking the books all those years. Eddie was eager to close out the company's first fiscal year on a high note by whatever means necessary. Warranty fraud was common, with Eddie refusing to honor refunds or exchanges but telling the manufacturers he did anyways. Because of the relatively high overhead of investigating such deception, it went mostly unchallenged. Another technique was to inflate the inventory numbers, giving the impression that the business held onto much more than it actually owned. Numbers were pumped up by as much as $2 million in 1985, and even more in subsequent years. When auditors came, they were always accompanied by a trusted manager who lied about the numbers to their face, at times counting shoddy products as top-shelf goods or even adding empty boxes to the count. Knowing most of these auditors were single young men, Sammy instructed female Crazy Eddie employees to flirt with them, distracting them from their duties and forcing them to cut corners to meet deadlines. At times, he even had them arrange dinner dates to discuss business, on the company's dime, of course. Eddie was now selling stock whenever he could, reeling in millions of dollars in personal wealth. Whenever investors called him on this, Eddie's famous excuse was that he was simply diversifying his profile. As with the auditors, the investors fell for his claims. Sammy was formally installed as the Crazy Eddie CFO in 1986. His first order was to continue cleaning up the books while finding ways to subvert slowing sales figures by whatever means necessary. He concocted a scheme he'd call the Panama Pump, which used Panama's banking privacy laws to help launder some of the skim money from Israel. The idea was to break up these transferred funds and pour them into the individual stores, thus inflating their earnings and making growth exponentially stronger. This fueled greater excitement on the stock market, giving the impression that Eddie Antar was a magician who understood his business better than his peers. Adding to this, auditors left their paperwork in locked boxes at the Crazy Eddie stores, and since Sammy knew exactly where they kept the keys on site, he was able to manipulate their ledgers after hours. Crazy Eddie expanded to over 20 locations across New York by mid-1986, and plans were in place to add almost a dozen more stores over the following year. Eddie was also ready to pull a trigger on the Crazy Eddie World of Home Entertainment Shopping Network, a move that, if successful, would stretch the retailer's influence across the whole of America without the need for costly brick-and-mortar stores. Meanwhile, the rest of the Antars were dumping their shares of the company, raking in tens of millions of dollars. Little did investors know what was really going on, though it wasn't long before the cracks began to show.
Okay, first of all, we want to thank everybody here for a magnificent job. The store looks absolutely beautiful. Records looks great. Stock looks great. Service, sales, cashier, every single department throughout the store really looks fantastic. It's one of the prettiest stores we have ever seen on a grand opening, and we want to thank everybody for their efforts individually and collectively. We worked together. I can see everybody here did it as a team, and it really shows very well. We have a very interesting thing occurring today. For the first time in our chain's history, we have 2 stores opening in one day. That has never ever occurred before. This is a milestone in the history of the company in that not only has it not done before, but the entire public and Wall Street and the business community is watching us. Can we do this? Can we pull it off? Can we open up 2 stores, 2 greatest grand opening sales in one single day? I say we can do it, and not only that, I say we're going to beat the hell out of Staten Island.
Sammy and Eddie came up with new schemes to keep the train running throughout 1987. The duo sold off merchandise to smaller shops, having them pay in a series of several checks that could be cashed at the stores themselves rather than at the head office. This inflated the sales figures for each individual Crazy Eddie outlet, suggesting that the company was continuing to grow. Meanwhile, Eddie decided to move on from his role as chief executive officer in the second week of 1987. Citing personal reasons, Eddie directed Sammy to tell reporters that he had become gravely sick and needed time to recover. In a move no one saw coming, he installed his brother Mitchell as the new CEO. Unfortunately, Eddie's departure depressed certain speculators and analysts. Others were furious, threatening to sue over insider trading in the wake of Eddie's stock dump the previous year. Everything was starting to crumble around Crazy Eddie by halfway through 1987. Competition was heating up, and the Antar family struggled to keep momentum. But this wasn't the only issue. Sammy wrote that the distraction of family drama had contributed to the underperformance of the company. Indeed, Eddie's treatment of his ex-wife had come back to bite him as she lawyered up at the worst possible time for him and the company. The explosive growth that had made it the darling of Wall Street was slowing to a snail's pace. And Sammy Antar explained that the company would need to make 4 times what it had in the first few years if it was to remain solvent. This, of course, was a consequence of deflating the skimmed cash reserve and pouring it back into the company. In other words, more fraud was needed just to catch up with the previous fraud. Despite the Antar's best efforts, the freefall continued. Stocks had plummeted from their peak to $17.50 a share, still generous considering how much deception propped them up. As the battle with his ex-wife continued, Eddie was outraged at how unequivocally his family took Debbie One's side, a betrayal he refused to let go of. This came to a head when a vengeful Eddie suddenly axed his father, brother, and mother-in-law from key positions in the company hierarchy. Rather than face his wrath, Eddie's other brother Mitchell stepped down in June. Shares continued dropping until they bottomed out at $6 apiece. More family drama involving Debbie One came to light, with Eddie pulling every stop to ensure his ex-wife didn't get her share of the fortune. He had strong-armed her into signing an unfair agreement penned by his very own lawyer cousin Solomon. Solomon even forged her signature on key documents, which would have gone unnoticed if not for the keen eye of Eddie's father, who observed that the area code used for the letterhead wouldn't have existed at the time of signing. Amidst all this, the threat of a takeover now loomed over the faltering Crazy Eddie company. A handful of interested billionaires had offered help to attempt a management-led buyout. Sammy hoped this could provide enough cover to clean everything up while they continued managing the company. His idea was to seek out another electronics firm to merge with Crazy Eddie and use that as an excuse if word of financial issues got out. But the in-house takeover plan was stymied by an unexpected third party. An upstart businessman from Texas named Elias Zinn had been watching from the sidelines, eager to gobble up the company the first chance he got. With Elias buying shares by the hundreds of thousands, it wasn't long before analysts saw the writing on the wall. Talk of a takeover prompted an investigation into the inner workings of Crazy Eddie, and Eddie's treachery was quickly uncovered. Faced with an onslaught of antitrust lawsuits from enraged shareholders, there was little that could be done to stop the prodding. And having pissed off most of his family through a combination of the divorce, hot-headed firings, and a general unpleasantness, Eddie found himself painted into a corner with no one to save him. He had already cashed out most of his shares, giving him little maneuverability to stop the inevitable. The jig was up. Whether he liked it or not, Eddie was about to be given the boot from his own company. His few remaining collaborators purged all the incriminating paperwork they could get their hands on, but it was already too late. Members of the Antar family, burned by Eddie's thirst for vengeance, cozied up to Elias, if only to save their own skin. Elias found an ally and fellow investor Victor Palmieri, with whom he joined forces to take over the embattled company. The Zinn Palmieri team completed the management transition by November of 1987. Employees at all levels had found themselves out of a job, and company assets were used in a feeble attempt to balance the books. But losing Crazy Eddie would be the least of the Antar family's troubles. The Securities and Exchange Commission was breathing down their neck. Someone on the inside had spilled the beans about the fraud. An investigation was launched that targeted the whole lot of them, and what it uncovered was ugly. Crazy Eddie's new owners believed they could salvage this mess if they downsized. They were wrong. The Zinn Palmieri alliance brought one Bob Marmon on board to act as chief financial officer, a level-headed suit who they hoped could steer the ship in the right direction. Bob's first decision was to conduct a complete inventory check of each and every Crazy Eddie, days after cleaning house of the old guard. Meeting with the now deposed Sammy Antar, Bob was astounded to find nearly all the paperwork had been purged. The inventory count went ahead anyway, and the results were unbelievable. They found the company was over $65 million short of the inventory figures the Antar clan had reported, far more than a simple rounding error. By now, the SEC was making headway in acquiring evidence in their case against the Antars and had compelled Sammy to testify. Naturally, he lied the whole way through. Eddie himself had rarely been seen since late 1987, only reaching out to Sammy if he needed something. Rather than keeping him in his pocket throughout the testimony, though, Eddie didn't give him a dime to cover his legal fees. Sammy was beginning to feel not only the financial pinch, but the realization that Eddie would probably screw him over. As for the new owners of the company, things of course were far from peachy. Morale was at an all-time low, and charting a course forward was all but impossible. Liquidation was a necessity just to cover outstanding debt. It appeared the company's death was all but certain. Fans of the Crazy Eddie conglomerate were blindsided. Surely this couldn't be the end. As business was winding down within the company, investigations plowed full steam ahead. With this, Eddie finally flaked on the one person who had stayed with him thick and thin, Sammy Antar. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, it would be that nebbish younger cousin left to clean up the mess. Eddie simply didn't care. Despite Sammy's unassuming nature, he had no intention of taking the fall for that no-good traitor of a cousin. Eddie's imminent exit plan involved fleeing the United States completely. To this end, he filled his international bank accounts with the money he had left, and went to work ensuring he had as many bogus passports as he'd need to stay on the run. Meanwhile, Sammy began angling for a way to get out of trouble through cooperation. This, of course, would be a tough sell. How convenient was it that the architect of America's greatest retail fraud had a face turn as soon as trouble was at his doorstep? Sammy undoubtedly had an uphill battle ahead of him if he was to succeed in coming clean and save his own hide. At the recommendation of a friend, he chose a lawyer named Anthony Mautone as his defense, who made it abundantly clear that Sammy was to be perfectly honest with him or he'd be out the door. He dared not test Mautone. Even with cooperation, though, the SEC wanted him to spend at least 5 years in jail. His only hope was a young FBI agent named Paul Hayes, who Mautone encouraged him to speak with. Out of options, Sammy followed up on the offer and rattled off everything he knew about the fraud, just as he had with Mautone. Over the course of almost 2,000 phone calls, he told the FBI agent absolutely everything, frantic to avoid jail time. The SEC finally made their move in summer 1989, quickly making deals with minor players as they reached for the bigger prize of Eddie and Sammy. One advantage Sammy had was his ability to expound or correct some of the details the SEC got wrong based on their own witnesses' testimony. Meanwhile, the Crazy Eddie bankruptcy went ahead in late 1989. Throughout the summer, stores continued to close, bringing the total to less than half of what it was at the start of the year. DJ Jerry Carroll cashed out on a wave of everything must go type commercials. By November, the last remaining outlets shuttered their doors for good. The book was closed on Crazy Eddie, but the man himself was still out there. Debbie won a court battle against the unscrupulous Solomon Antar in 1990. Yet somehow he managed to skirt by any sort of penalty aside from legal fees. Regrettably, efforts to get Debbie her portion of the fortune were obstructed by Eddie's ongoing legal troubles. Eddie was finally being charged with fraud thanks to the lies he wrote into his reports, and of course, all that insider trading. He was supposed to appear before the court in mid-February, but was nowhere to be found. Out went the arrest warrants. Eddie gave himself up after a few days, but in a stroke of luck, the judge handling his case had gone on holiday, providing Eddie the perfect chance to escape justice. Working to change his appearance, Eddie fled to Israel and became David Cohen, an alter ego he had created a few years prior with the help of a Brazilian passport. With money hidden all over the world, Eddie wouldn't have too much trouble financing his great escape. Depending on where he was, he became different people, being careful not to draw too much attention lest he be arrested and sent back to the States. His alcoholism only worsened over this period. Meanwhile, Sammy continued trying to convince prosecutors of his earnestness in unraveling the fraud. Though investigators remained leery, he managed to provide crucial info that tipped them off to the Antar bank accounts in Israel, where much of the money was kept. Eddie's father Sam started getting faxes from an unknown source, which accused him, amongst other things, of being a, quote, bullshit philosopher, and generally all-around scumbag. Aside from the insults, the message promised that Sam would soon see his day of reckoning. For now, the author would remain anonymous. As for the younger Sammy, he didn't just talk, he sang. Details thought lost due to the shredding of crucial documents were recounted by the repentant fraudster. Sammy later wrote that snitching on the family was a last resort after their own disloyalty left him out to dry. Eddie's own father eventually flipped and admitted to his own part in the fraud. Meanwhile, Israeli police were made aware of who Eddie was and kept a close eye on him. They didn't nab him immediately, merely to allow the case to build against Eddie, but his days as a free man were numbered. The authorities had been tipped off to Eddie's whereabouts after he tried taking money out of his Swiss bank account. It turned out the SEC was already onto his scheme and had frozen the account to try and bait him out of hiding, and it worked. An enraged Eddie had no choice but to fly back to Israel empty-handed, where his every move was still being watched. He was finally arrested in the summer of 1992 while he was on his way to the convenience store for his morning routine. Joey Diaz recounted a popular legend about the arrest on Joe Rogan's podcast.
He fled to Israel, and he fled for a while, but they knew he was a pussy hound. Right? So they got him like Escobar style. They got him like, on the phone, like I'm going to the store, something crazy. And what they did was they put a blonde on the side of the road with a miniskirt. And they knew eventually he would drive by and stop.
No.
And he stopped. That's how they nailed him.
Police raided Eddie's home, taking all the evidence that had been left scattered here and there. At the time of Eddie's arrest, it was thought he was planning to hit the road once again, but it seems hubris got the better of him. He had foolishly used his own birthday for the David Cohen passport, which helped confirm his true identity. Brothers Mitchell and Alan Antar were arrested in America, though other figures in the conspiracy, like Eddie's father, got off due to a lack of evidence. For the time being, Eddie was held in Israeli custody at a maximum security prison. He would soon be back in America to face the music. Conveniently, Eddie's illness from years ago seemed to flare up again thanks to the stresses of incarceration. His act was so convincing that one New York Post reporter actually believed him to be on death's door. Even with his questionable condition, Eddie did have cause for despair. His 17-year-old daughter Danielle was facing her own diagnosis of cancer, a terminal one at that. All the money in the world couldn't give him free access to be by her side. He would have to abide by the rules of the game and throw in the towel. Eddie Antar was extradited from Israel in 1993. Fortunately for him, his debilitating sickness had coincidentally subsided upon returning to American soil. Now there was no escape from the law, no excuses to try and cheat it. The presiding justice, Judge Nicholas Politan, kept a tight lid on how much information about the trial the press could access. Yet this didn't stop it from becoming a total media circus.
Crazy Eddie Antar continues to be held without bail tonight, facing trial in June for skimming millions of dollars from his chain of electronic stores and ripping off shareholders by falsely driving up stock. Tonight, Antar is defending his innocence, speaking out for the first time since his arrest.
Yes, I believe I'm a victim.
Of what?
Of circumstances, some of them my own, of which I'm willing to take the blame for. Some of them not my own. Some of them may be the government's.
If found guilty of the 19 federal counts against him, Antar faces fines of $160 million and 100 years in prison.
I think about it, but I know that I'm right. That's why I want to go to trial. I want my day in court. I guess, like you say, maybe I really am crazy, but I'm not.
Deliberations poured over every last detail of the crimes committed. The early days of skimming, the Panama Pump scheme, all of it. Before the trial began, Judge Politan allowed Eddie to visit his dying daughter for a half hour a day, under the supervision of his attending deputy. Some saw such restrictions as cruel. Tragically, Danielle died just 2 days into the trial, and Eddie begged for a brief respite to get her affairs in order and to pay final respects. Judge Politan agreed on the condition that Eddie pay up the missing $60 million he had cheated from investors. Eddie refused, and so his request was coldly rebuked. As such, Judge Politan only gave him the privilege of attending the funeral. Once that was over, it was back to jail. The Antar brothers became begrudging allies to try and convince the court that their cousin Sammy was behind everything, and that his testimony was yet another lie to get out of trouble. Sammy remained steadfast he was telling the truth. He told reporters he had decided to fess up out of a newfound sense of honor, having turned a new leaf in the wake of turning 30. Try as they might, Eddie & Co.'s lawyers couldn't pierce through the testimony of Sammy. A combination of skillful tact and malicious compliance frustrated their efforts to characterize Sammy as a vengeful puppet master. Ironically, he managed to play them like a fiddle. Sammy did admit on his blog that the defense had correctly predicted his motives. Quote, "I did not cooperate with the government and civil plaintiffs for altruistic reasons. I was motivated by the fear of a very long prison sentence. It was purely a selfish decision motivated by fear." Whatever Sammy's reasoning was, however, his deposition was deemed sound enough to justify his plea bargain and to sour the bench on the rest of the Antars.
All right, Crazy Eddie Antar has been found guilty on all 17 counts in one of the biggest stock scandals in United States history. A federal jury in Newark convicted Antar of falsely inflating the stock of his electronics chain and bilking investors out of $75 million. His brother Mitchell Antar was found guilty of 6 of 8 charges. Brother Alan Antar was acquitted of all charges. Crazy Eddie is facing 100 years in prison and a $160 million fine.
Sammy Antar's plea bargain forced him to take responsibility for the charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit mail fraud. For this, he received 6 months house arrest, over 1,000 hours community service, 3 years probation, and hefty financial penalties. Meanwhile, Eddie of course had his lawyers file an appeal. One might have expected this to be an unlikely Hail Mary from a desperate man. But the circumstances of the trial led to accusations that Judge Politan had been biased. An offhand comment he had made implied he had already determined Eddie's guilt before hearing the totality of the case. Adding to this was a perception of callousness for his reaction to Daniel Antar's death. The appeals court came to agree with the defense's arguments, and thus, in 1995, the convictions against Eddie and his brother Mitchell were overturned. Prosecutors scurried to retry Eddie, and within a year, he was back in the courtroom. This time would be different, though. Eddie admitted to his fraud and was ordered to pay back $150 million, along with serving an almost 7-year stint in federal custody. While in jail, Eddie kept himself busy by working in the kitchen, cooking up kosher foods for the more faithful inmates. Efforts were made to recoup the losses caused by the Antar family crime syndicate, but it would take almost 2 decades for this to wrap up. The US government went to work recovering Eddie Antar's assets across half a dozen countries worldwide, with some success. To this day, millions remain unaccounted for. While Eddie and Mitchell were behind bars, attempts were made by their nephews to resurrect the Crazy Eddie brand. A new store was opened in New Jersey around February 1998, nearly a decade out since the original outlets closed. The brothers also launched CrazyEddieOnline.com to bring the former electronics giant into the new age. The New York Times reported that this effort was bankrolled by Eddie's mother, and although the incarcerated Antars weren't able to help out, Alan Antar teamed up with Jerry Carroll to offer consultation and direction. Despite high hopes that they could bring back the glory days, this new Crazy Eddie closed within a year, leaving the Antars with just the online store. Eddie Antar was released from prison in 1999, owing to time served. He had married Debbie too by this point and was expecting a son. That same year, it was discovered that the vulgar faxes sent to Sam Antar from years ago were penned by none other than the former consigliere for Eddie, Solomon Antar. Solomon himself managed to worm out of his own legal troubles against Debbie 1 and has kept a low profile ever since. He remains a member of the New York State Bar. Eddie found his way back into the retail world when he agreed to take on the role of director of marketing for the Crazy Eddie website, assisted by his old pal Larry Weiss. Eddie's reputation had understandably made him investment poison, however, and so operations ceased in 2004. The business trademark was put up for auction on eBay in 2006, but it didn't sell. Drama within the Antar family started up again when Eddie and Sammy were finally brought face to face almost 2 decades after the downfall of Crazy Eddie. The cousins traded blame and accusations against one another for all of America to see in a 2007 TV special on CNBC.
I think I've thought about it for the last couple of days. I think redemption is a noble cause.
It's not important to me in the great scheme of things. It means nothing.
You know, please do not.
Apologize.
Please do not interrupt me.
I apologize.
Please do not interrupt me.
I will not interrupt you. Go ahead, Eddie. After 20 years, I owe you that.
Redemption is about forgiveness. And forgiveness means that you have to be able to forgive yourself.
That I cannot do.
If you cannot forgive yourself, you know, I ask you not to interrupt. If you continue to interrupt, then we really don't have no reason to go forward with this conversation.
Okay.
Go ahead, Eddie. I went to prison for 7 years. Hard time prison. I was a fugitive for 2 years. I was 3 years on probation. It's 12 years of my life. Gone, in a sense. But no blame to anybody else other than myself.
You brought us up to be crooks, Eddie. You taught everything I became came from you, Eddie. Okay? Now, I don't blame myself, but everything I became, I learned from you.
You didn't just learn from me. We learned from, we learned,
yes, the
like
culture.
you learned, we learned the culture.
That's right.
So it's not what I taught you, you knew the culture.
Good.
So do not sit there and, by the way, do not raise your voice to me. And you don't
I
have
will
to
do
call
whatever I damn well please, Eddie. I fought for you like
excuse me.
crazy. Doing
Sam,
it for myself, I fought. I stayed there and I took the heat. You ran. You ran like a coward.
I'm not a coward, Sam.
Yes, you left me out there hanging, my friend.
I didn't leave.
Listen, you're not even a friend. You're just a thug, just like me, 2-bit thug.
Can you forgive Eddie?
No, because I can't forgive myself.
Can you forgive Sam for turning you in?
Yeah, actually, I forgave him a long time ago. For me, past for me is a black hole. People live in the past. A black hole, you know what it does to you. It sucks you in and destroys you. It crushes you.
One last attempt to revive Crazy Eddie was led by a Brooklyn entrepreneur named Jack Jamel, who acquired the rights in 2009. Starting out as an online store with hopes to expand to brick and mortar, this last hurrah was once again dead in the water. By 2012, it was clear that Crazy Eddie was doomed to exist only as a memory. Work to recover the funds pilfered by the Antar family was considered finished that same year, with about $120 million tracked down. Eddie Antar died on September 10, 2016, of unknown causes. It's believed his lifelong battle with alcoholism had something to do with it. As for Sam E. Antar, he has since used his expertise in securities fraud as a force for good, working as a forensic accountant and advisor on white-collar fraud. Though he has amassed an impressive clientele list that includes legal and government agencies, he has often joked that he'd still be a criminal had he never been caught. Nevertheless, Sam remains regretful, even bitter, about the criminal enterprise he helped build all those years ago, once deriding efforts by Danny DeVito to produce a Crazy Eddie movie as lionizing, quote, heinous, cold-blooded crimes. Most recently, one of the nephews involved with the 1998 revival, Sam A. Antar, has been caught up in his own fraud-related legal problems. He was arraigned on charges of cheating investors, many of whom were friends. He has since pled guilty and was sentenced in December 2022 to 3 years in prison. It seems even the next generation of Antars still have yet to learn the lesson of playing with fire when it comes to fraud. Needless to say, the Crazy Eddie story is extremely complex owing to the multiple players involved. In recent years, there has been an attempt to unravel what really went on by journalists and television producers alike, usually falling back on commentary from Sam E. Antar and the pages and pages he has written on his blog or given to interviewers. Yet there has been little success in getting perspectives from others involved, like Eddie's surviving brothers, Alan and Mitchell Antar. Whether this is because of their own reluctance, or simply a lack of interest on the part of researchers, it leaves an incomplete picture of what happened all those years ago. Attitudes towards Eddie Antar remain mixed. Some, like Sammy, refuse to see him as having any redeeming factors, while many of the underrepresented characters in this story cling to the good memories they do have of the man. Whatever the truth, the overall legend of Crazy Eddie serves as a twisted tale of one man's attempt to achieve the American dream, be it by any means, foul or fair.
It's Crazy Eddie's greatest grand opening sale ever. All great Crazy Eddie stores are celebrating the grand opening of Crazy Eddie's new Syosset Long Island store at 350 Jericho Turnpike with the guaranteed lowest sale prices on anything and everything in home entertainment. Shop around, get the lowest sale prices you can find, but don't buy anything till you see Crazy Eddie, because Crazy Eddie will beat any price you can find. It's Crazy Eddie's greatest grand opening sale ever, going on now at all great Crazy Eddie locations with prices that are insane. It's not the 4th of July, it's not Thanksgiving, it's not even Christmas. It's better than all those. It's Crazy Eddie Day. You'll save money like never before during Crazy Eddie's Crazy Eddie Day sale with the guaranteed lowest prices on anything and everything in home entertainment. Shop around, get the lowest sale prices you can find, then go to Crazy Eddie and he'll beat him. It's Crazy Eddie Day. Save big, big, big bucks during Crazy Eddie's Crazy Eddie Day sale. Crazy Eddie, his prices are insane. Thanks a lot.